I want to introduce this morning's speaker, Annie Novak. Seems to come to find out that she and I share a connection. We both were involved with Groundwork Hudson Valley, what I knew as Groundwork Hudson Valley, where I was the deputy director for many, many years before I left to become the National Youth Program Director for Groundwork USA. But Annie Novak, I had heard about her from before. She is quite the busy person and has done so much to advance ecosystems in our own area. She is the founder and director of Growing Chefs, Field to Fork Food Education Program, the manager of the Edible Academy at the New York Botanical Garden, and co-founder and farmer of Eagle Street Rooftop Farm in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, in partnership with Good Green and Broadway Stages. She is the author of the Rooftop Growing Guide, How to Transform Your Roof into a Garden or Farm, published by 10 Speed Press. She's a passionate educator, and he teaches locally and nationally and has spoken at conferences around the country on the connections between people, food, and ecology and the benefits of urban agriculture. Annie writes in her own words for The Atlantic, Rodale's Organic Life magazine, Wilder Quarterly, and Diner Journal. Annie's work in agriculture has been featured in the New York Times, Modern Farmer, WNYC, NPR, New York Magazine, Edible Brooklyn, The Martha Stewart Show, Grist, The Huffington Post, and The Cooking Channel, among other publications. And it has been candidly interviewed on multiple blogs and locally in her own Brooklyn neighborhood paper, The Greenpoint Gazette. In 2012, Annie was recognized by the Audubon Society's Women in Conservation Program for her work in New York City. In 2016, Annie's work at the Eagle Street Rooftop Farm was recognized by Martha Stewart Living American Made Award, and in 2008 she joined the board of the American Bird Conservancy. And we were just on a hike down the river, and she was getting us to listen just to using our ears to all the birds in our neighborhood before the whirl of leaf blowers took over. But she could still hear them even beyond that. So I bring up Annie Novak.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, I have a few pieces of technology to set up. I'm just checking my mic is on, correct? You guys can hear me? Okay, great. And I'm going to start screen sharing. There we go.
A youngin' with a mask on.
Wonderful. Look at that. Okay, great. So I am going to speak today about one of my favorite topics, which is observation practices. We, as was mentioned, went for a really lovely walk. I'm not sure how many of you have walked through this particular neighborhood, particularly down to the waterfront. We're at low tide right now. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. But the ability to walk through any landscape, whether it's suburban or urban, like where I live, or a fully natural landscape with no human interruption, and use your best observation practices is, I think, the best way to never be bored. And not being bored is very important in every regard. It's probably my favorite thing about the work that I do is that it's infinitely interesting, and it gives me an infinite appreciation and gratitude as I move through the world. So today's talk, after Elaine and I did some brainstorming, where we landed was to take a class that I teach called How to Read a Landscape, which is very long. It's like a 5 or 6 hour course, and condense it down to, how much time do I have?
2 days.
2 days. No, really though. I'm 45, 30 minutes?
30 minutes.
30,
yeah. 30, 40 minutes.
We're going to do just fine. So I did. I condensed the class down, and really what I want to focus on, there's going to be a moment in this presentation where I talk about soil science for like 30 seconds, which is a larger part of the class. But what I'd like to do is really focus on those observation practices. So part of why I'm stepping away from the podium, I'd like your engagement in this, and that includes all of you online. There are some tools that are introduced that will help you with that. But again, since this is really meant to be a talk about giving you tools to go out into the world and explore, perhaps with a different lens, your interaction is important to me. So I'm actually going to move a few things around here. This is not my home office, so okay, here we go. All right, so for starters, I have circled where we are in the Northeast. This is a very special natural area. How many of you have lived in other parts of the U.S.? Okay, quite a few, about half. Good. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Chicago. And I would say that one of the things that defines to me the difference between where I grew up and where we are now is that there are a lot more natural preserved areas in New York State and along New Jersey, along the coast, than there are where I grew up. Chicago was, of course, once part of a really distinct, beautiful, ecologically interesting, global, unique prairie landscape, and that has been largely lost. We have about 0.01% of the natural landscape left in the Chicagoland area. So it is a blessing to be here. Of the North American native bird populations, half of them, close to half of them, pass through just New York City alone. It's close to 400 bird species. So it's truly exceptional. And I, as a person who lives in Brooklyn, love the fact that I can see saltwater, freshwater, estuary systems. There's old growth woodland where I work at the New York Botanical Garden. It's above and beyond. So even walking down to the river here, to this watershed, I was blown away by how many examples you have of beautiful, relatively old growth trees, particularly by the, what is the name of the historic house that's here that we just passed? Brisk, thank you, yeah. So right near there are 3 absolutely stunning oak trees that, I mean, they look to be easily upwards of 150 years old. So it's pretty cool. And then I will use QR codes throughout the talk if you have your phones handy and you're curious, or those of you watching online, if you pull out your phones. These QR codes will lead to more references about what I'm speaking on. So I was already introduced. I don't have to go into too much detail here, but this link will take you to, I think, a page that will take you to future classes. So that's the only plug I'm going to make if you want to take any of my classes. This is the farm that was mentioned. This is a rooftop farm. It's 3 stories up in the air. I think it's important just to tell you 1 or 2 things about myself and give you a picture, just because that way you'll have an understanding of my assumptions and my background. So one of the things that you'll notice is that this is an agricultural landscape. I was introduced to the natural world through crops, which are, of course, 1 foot in the human world and our needs and desires, and 1 foot in the actual natural world. So my background in learning about trees and soil and insects and a lot of things that exist independently of human life was coming through this lens. And I would say that when I've reflected on this for like close to 20 years now, I've learned to love agriculture, but it also is a very conflicted space, right? There's a lot about agriculture that stands in direct resistance to things we could be doing better with the natural landscape. So it's made me a better farmer to be someone who also likes to bird watch and cares about trees. This is the Edible Academy. This is a site that I helped build and now manage. It's a fully LEED certified facility. So if when you guys are updating this building, you want to come visit, come be my guest. We have a lot of cool features here. You can see the green roof. It also has geothermal, composting toilets, etc.
Where is that?
This is at the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. That QR code will take you there, but it's just nybg.org, and then you can look up the Edible Academy. And I work in children's education, if you couldn't tell when we were going on the walk. This is just a quick comic to sort of introduce the talk. I'll give you a second to read it because it's funny.
You might want to read it for us. So
Oh, sure.
a lot of us have the older eyes.
Sorry. The essence of it is there are 2 people out for a walk, and they're making observations about everything they're seeing, from deer poop to glacial till. And then there's a comment at the end there, it's been an hour and we walked 3 feet. And the other person says, 3 amazing feet.
That's right.
I think that's an important thing to notice. Again, we went for a walk this morning, and the walk to the park, which was where we thought we were going to do most of our observations, the walk to the park was the best part. It's where we saw the bald eagle. It's where we learned a lot about the way that squirrels make drays or nests. So I think this is a good place to start. There's no space, there's no ecosystem, there's no landscape that is uninteresting. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question. Again, if you'd like to use a QR code, this will take you to a space where you can answer this question. For those of you participating online, you can also put that in the chat, or you can fill it out on the form. But what I would ask, since you guys are here in person, is if you want to answer the question and then just turn to your neighbor and share what you're thinking. And I'll give us about a minute for that. And I'm going to pull up the form so I can see your responses. I'm able to see the chat, right?
Different ecosystems.
I think I can pull that up so we can all see it. Okay, so friends, I'm going to close the chat, but in a minute I'm going to open it again just so we can all see your responses. Thanks. And I'm pulling up the Google form here if that's the way you're using it. And this is a field guide if you all use these at home. This is one of the intro pages of a Peterson guide. Okay, practicum 1. This is where I need the home office. All right. Would anyone like to share? What are we looking at here?
It's really quite a diverse landscape.
Aha, okay. What are you noticing that makes you think that? I would agree. Lots of colors. Okay, great. So even simply without reading the text, we can tell there's some diversity happening because lots of things are being represented. Excellent. What else? Go ahead.
It looks like our part of New Jersey gets both kinds of forests, oak, hickory, and northern hardwood kind of overlapping.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a good observation. The other thing I'd point out, which I like about that is, a subtle thing here, but this is a map with some geopolitical boundaries but no labels. So map literacy, which you just proved, you can read a map. You know where you are, and you can see that crossover. I will happily ask for new observations, but I'm also curious as a follow-up, what does that tell you about this area if you're seeing two major forest types, forest communities?
You're in a convergence zone.
Fancy term. Tell us what that means.
We're in an area where two ecosystems are kind of at the margins of each of them, which have their own kind of plant and animal kingdoms running in those places.
Excellent. Yeah.
What are the two different?
Which are the two you noticed?
I started out with northern hardwood and oak hickory, but I bet we can get northern pine oak on the seashore edge.
Yes.
And that suggests there's like twice as many birds and critters down on the ground
Yes.
in that kind of a mix.
Yes, excellent. So we can infer ecological diversity because of these different trees. And I love that you connected an entirely different species. If you know you have XYZ trees, you might have ABC birds. Exactly.
Annie, and for those online, you may want to repeat what we're saying because they cannot hear us at all.
Oh, of course. Sorry about that. All right, I will do that moving forward. And let me share quickly, I think you all can read this chat, but we're saying ecosystems align with geology, both past, sorry, that shot forward, both past and present. New Jersey has two, excellent. So we can even see a little inference of time in this map, how these spaces might have developed or changed. Water temperatures and elevations seem to dictate forest communities. So there's a connection between the natural geography and the type of plants that you see. Ellen and Richard, I agree. I will repeat the questions now, or the answers. The soils in our area tend to be acidic. Okay, so from the plant population, we can make inferences about soil type. And apparently I've lived in the NPO most of my life. When I was younger, close to the Pine Barrens, exactly. And I think that was what you were inferring as well, Diane, about how closer to the coast there's a whole different ecosystem, including a lot of pines. Fantastic. So this is the list that, let me just close this off. This is a list that overlaps with a lot of the suggestions you just made, as well as a few others. For example, we talked about the geography. I would also suggest that the weather and its climate also align with plant preferences, which of course ties into time as well, right? Both seasonal time as weather changes and also time over generations as climate changes. And then sunlight hours, which didn't get mentioned, but I think particularly because the band just played like my new favorite song about the winter solstice, sunlight hours is a really important consideration. You're going to have a different amount of daylight throughout the year in the south of the country as you will in the north and northeast. What else? Organic matter content, that third bullet point we'll talk about momentarily, but that is also something you can infer with regards to soil. Excellent. So I show you a guide first in part because we're all gathered in one space, we're looking at a screen. What I would encourage you to think about is that now as you move through a neighborhood or a landscape, whether you're here or in Japan, these are the types of things you can infer if you have one piece of the puzzle. If you see a tree, you know that tree and its normal habits, like a red maple, very adaptive tree, loves wet growing conditions, you can start to think about extrapolating all these other inferences about a landscape. All right, so now I'm going to take you to one of these very special landscapes. Let me actually, do tell me what time I'm meant to wrap up, sorry.
You're okay.
No, I know, but I'm wondering if I should do two or one of these.
Yeah.
Of these landscapes. Just go ahead, do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have 30 minutes, please.
Okay, great. Sweet. This is a great landscape. That's why I don't want to miss it. All right, so this is a New Jersey pygmy pine plains. I'm sorry, this is actually out on Long Island, my bad. This is a pygmy pine plains. Have folks here been to the Pine Plains in New Jersey? Okay, excellent. Yes. And then what about on Long Island? Yes, okay, good. So the three of you are now in charge of the field trip for the rest of the group. This is internationally unique. This is a treasure. And I actually could say that about like every landscape. They're all awesome. But pygmy pine plains are really special. They have a few adaptations that make them really special. One is, you may know this already, but we were under a glacier until quite recently. And so to me, one of the fascinating things about Long Island is it's only 6,000 years old, which is mind-blowing. I mean, so the soil is quite sandy. It's very calcium rich. That has implication, of course, for what plants will grow. And then Long Island is also susceptible to quite a lot of natural fire. That's less the case now because a lot of people live there and they don't love that. But this is an ecosystem that really represents plant adaptations to fire. So the pitch pine is a tree that you can see here some of the lower branches seem lost. That is a natural fire adaptation where the tree will senesce or kill off its lower branches, and then new branches can actually sprout from the trunk, which is unusual for trees, right? Usually it's the branch that produces the new buds. But that capacity means that if the entire lower area is swept by fire because of all this scrubby growth, the tree can nonetheless continue to regenerate. This tree, also, it's a little hard to see in this picture because I am not in it and you can't see my 6 feet against the tree, but these are trees that naturally grow to about 40 feet. And in this landscape, because of the very well-drained soil, because of the high acidity of the soil, because of the high, the lower organic matter content of the soil, they only grow about 12 feet high. So that's the pygmy part of the pygmy pine plains. There are only 3 of these in the world, and I think Long Island and 2 places in New Jersey, or maybe it's Long Island, New Jersey, and 1 place near New Hampshire, I'm forgetting, where you can see them. Oh no, Shawagunk, which is upstate. All right, so what else can I point out about this? Yeah, one other thing to point out. So with pygmy growth, or bonsai, which would be the sort of human technique, with plants, one thing I would think about entering this landscape is, how can I walk into this landscape and know that it is quite old, right? Because if you see a tree, you're used to seeing it 40 feet and it's only growing to 12, how can I be sure that I'm just not seeing a baby version of that tree? So one thing that I love about plants generally, but trees in particular, is that they can often express different characteristics as they age. So I challenge you all this spring, when you're walking around, if you see saplings, some species like tulip tree, for example, the leaves will be unbelievably cartoonishly large in the first 6 or 7 years of their life because they're trying to maximize photosynthetic surface area. And then as they grow, the leaves will chill out and grow to sort of their natural, average size. So pitch pines, when they are younger, the bark is different looking. Older mature trees develop a platy bark, whereas the younger trees often have sort of a dark scaly bark. So again, sorry it's hard to see in this picture, but there is evidence that these are older trees even though they've grown smaller. So when I enter this landscape, noticing that these are mature trees but nonetheless seem to be small, my inference might be that something's happening to condition them to grow smaller. And that's taking us back to glacial soil, low organic matter content, potentially high acidity. Other fun things to notice. This is a lichen up at the top right called reindeer lichen. And then on the left here where my finger is, this is a lichen, this little red dot, and this little red dot. That's called British soldier because it looks like it has a little red cap. I didn't name it, but it seems pretty apt. Lichens are a fantastic sign of health in an ecosystem. I did notice along the walk here, particularly when you got close to the river, a number of the oak trees had pretty good lichen populations growing on them. Lichen are a symbiosis between an algae and a fungus. Am I remembering that correctly? Yes. And they show, if they are present, they take a very long time to grow and they're very sensitive to atmospheric changes. So it's a sign of good air quality. And then I also showed the fruiting body of the pitch pine there. That's another great way to identify the tree. It has, again, this is getting a little too detailed, but This little prickle on each of these scales, this protuberance, it's called the umbo, that prickle is characteristic of a pitch pine as well. A lot of needles have them, a lot of conifers have them, but the pitch pine has them sort of right in the middle of the scale there. All right, so I'm going to make you all do this next. That's why I talked at you for a while, but your turn comes next with the next landscape. I just want to clarify something about the way that I move through a landscape processing these information. So when you walk into a landscape, we all come with things we already know, right? So I walked into the landscape fairly familiar that I was going into a pitch pine landscape. I also knew that there was a lichen there called British soldier. It's one of the easier ones to ID. And then I knew that soil was going to have some impact because I knew that Long Island was only 6,000 years old. So something was going to be wonky and different. But what that actually means, I don't know yet. So what is your prior knowledge? Then you can make observations. This is something I make all my students do, and I won't put you on the spot here, but if you walk into a room, for example, and you see someone sniffling, there's a proclivity to say, oh, I see Annie is sick. You don't know that. You know that she's sniffling. That's an observation. An assumption is that I'm sick, right? So here, I'm going to go ahead and observe that the trees seem short, and many seem to be missing their lower branches. What I will learn is that they've adapted to periodic burns. So when I took you through this landscape, I told you this. Now you know this. But when you walk into the landscape, it's important to make a clear observation and not jump right to a conclusion. And the reason for that, I think, particularly when you're acting as a naturalist, is that there are a lot of wonky things happening, and things happen differently in different landscapes. So clarifying what is an observation versus what you will learn and then can make an inference from is a good practice. So what I mean by learned here, this could be me telling you about lichens being good indicators of air quality. It could be something you read in a field guide. It could be something you learn over time as you make observations in that landscape, right? So I'm not prioritizing any kind of learned knowledge over another, just that you're separating what you've clearly observed versus what you have learned. You could say, Annie, are you sniffling because you're sick? I'll say, no, it's allergies. And then you'd be like, okay, I have learned that Annie has allergies. And that's a close-up of the soil. I am a deep soil dork, and I will not take you on that journey with me, but if you ever want to talk dirt, I'm here for you. The soil is indeed quite sandy, and what amazes me about this and the fact that anything grows there at all, we'll go to this in greater detail in a moment, but organic matter content are sort of these objects here, the needles, the soils, et cetera. The sand is the base property of the soil. And sorry, I keep moving around on you. So normally a mixture of this is needed to pass the nutrients up to plants, right? You need organic matter content to cycle nutrients up to plant. So the fact that the soil is this sandy that it must drain so quickly is astonishing that anything grows there at all. So I'll introduce one other practice. I don't think we'll have a chance to do this full practice, but it's a good one to take with you. And if any of you are educators, feel free to steal this. I usually ask when we enter a natural landscape of my students, what is your first impression? Then collecting all the data that you can see, and from that making inferences. I don't mind people making inferences as long as they're not conclusions, right? The perspective piece is what will you learn? What do you need to know? And then afterwards, what can you conclude from that? So again, this practice is just about deconstructing assumptions. All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about soil, and then I'm going to take you into a landscape where you can apply some of this information. As I mentioned briefly, soil has two sort of main components to it. One is just the raw sand, silt, and clay. Sand breaks down to become clay bits to become silty bits. Silt is the smallest. It's about 100 times smaller than a grain of sand. So I think a simple way of thinking about this is if you're on a beach and you see sand, you watch the waves wash up, the waves drop into the sand very easily, the water disappears, it doesn't pool. If you have a landscape that's primarily composed of, silt and then clay is the smallest, a landscape that's primarily clayey, which actually the Northeast is quite clayey, the water when it goes onto that landscape will sit. It's going to have a hard time draining. And that's because there's a lot less pore space. There's a lot less space between those particles. So this is, everywhere on Earth, the basis of what you're standing on. Now, in addition to that, we have this really fun, beautiful, delicious soil component called organic matter content. that is a process of time as well as it's a product in the soil. So when you hold up soil in your hand and you feel or you smell qualities about it, that is the active decomposition of things like fallen leaves, dead insects, etc. The active process of decomposition takes place over time. And so part of why it has a smell is there are agents like bacteria actively metabolizing and gassing. That's what you're smelling, are these chemicals breaking down. Then it stabilizes. There's nothing left to eat. There's no further smaller parts to break into. And then it's about 50% stable. In addition to that, organic matter content typically includes things like the actual leaves that have just fallen and the organisms that are about to eat them. So the amount of organic matter content in soil is put in balance with the sand, silt, and clay in the soil. Okay, science, science, science. What does that mean? Here are two landscapes. One is on Long Island, right next to a watershed, and the other is in the Bronx, also next to a watershed, although it's behind me in the photograph, so you can't see it. So ostensibly, we have two areas that have trees, that have leaf litter, that have soil of some content, and that have water. So one might think that there would be some shared qualities to them. So I gathered two soil samples, and I'm going to show you this video. And you tell me what you think is different. This is a simple test. It's called the Organic Matter Soil Composition Test. And on the left is the soil from Long Island, and the right is the soil from the Bronx. Oh, yeah. All right, what did we notice? Yes?
Soil on the left seems much darker, much more liquid.
Sure, so the soil on the left, you're saying what ended up being darker then?
It went on the left.
Right, the water, right, that drained through? Yeah, exactly. Yep. And you said much more liquid. How do you mean?
The one on the right is much more liquid.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. So you're noticing the water.
There's much more matter in it.
Yes. Okay. And anyone else want to add a thought about the way these soils behaved?
The left one looks like it has some foam on top.
So the left one, you're saying maybe had some foam on top
Yeah,
as it poured through?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So maybe some air bubbles escaping or something?
The
Right.
the Bronx soil on the right just seems like total clay probably because it just didn't dissolve at all.
Right. Okay. That's a good callback, Diane, and thank you for remembering that information. So sand, the water washes up on the beach. It goes right through. Clay, the particles are very small. There's very little pore space. That will create a sticky, tougher soil, right? What about the organic matter content? The amount of leaf litter, organic material, what do we think about which might have more organic matter content? This one here, exactly. Yeah, so if it's hard to see on the video, what I will tell you has happened, these were both just clods, like handfuls of soil. This one completely, the Long Island soil completely broke down and went through the sieve. The one on the right, the Bronx soil, is indeed, as Dan mentioned, clay soil, clay-based soil, and it has a high organic matter content. Lot of leaf litter in it, et cetera. That one's adhered. So the reason I start with this is because as we go into a new landscape, here we go. We're going to go visit Sandy Pond. You're going to see at frontal bipedal, forward-facing, 5 to 6 feet high plants. You'll hear animals, but the soil composition inherently has so much to do with informing what is happening in that space. So here, we're on Sandy Pond. What would you infer, or what do you observe, rather, first, about a place like Sandy Pond, just off the bat? Yes?
Its name implies there's a lot of sand in the soil.
You hit the nail on the head. One of my favorite things about maps is sometimes they'll just tell you what to expect. If you're on Chestnut Street, well, good luck looking for chestnut trees, but yeah, it's often the case. Maple Street, you might find maples. Yeah, so here we are at Sandy Pond. One nice thing about exploring landscapes that have water features is if you're curious about the soil, just look under the water because that's the soil right there, right? So even if I can't dig a hole a good place to start might just be looking at the shallows of the water. And indeed, there are patches of sand, so you got it. All right, so let's take a closer look. Here's another QR code if you want to use it. And folks online, you can use the chat as well. Let me just pull up the question. I believe all I'm asking you to do here is just observe. What do you notice? Actually, I can pull up the quiz myself. And this is not limited to soil. Just double check what the prompt is here. What do you notice and what does it make you wonder? Which is the same prompts we used for our walk today, actually, which was just lovely. So I'll give you a minute to make some notices. And if you want, you can turn to the person near you and share. You can put it in the chat, or you can put it into the form, and I will pull that up.
I always think that when they break and fall down like that, eventually they just sit and lie there, maybe for 100 years. I don't know how long it'll take for them, but eventually they'll be covered over and they'll become coal. That's what I think.
Oh my gosh, that is a very long-term view. I love that.
I see there's a mix of hardwood trees that lose their leaves in the wintertime and pine trees, or evergreens, whatever you call them,
Conifers, yeah.
that
Yeah.
keep their leaf structures going all winter long.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great observation. Are you noticing anything about where they are relative to each other or anything like that?
Well, the deciduous trees seem close, in a band toward the front of the picture, and the pine trees are toward the back.
Yeah,
I
so
don't
some
know if
clustering.
They grow in groups, or
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So that is kind of a curious thing about these populations, that they seem to be aggregated, right? Yeah, I appreciate that. I do see someone chimed in on the Google form, so good job figuring that out. Fallen trees is that they noticed, and the thing that made them wonder is, was there a recent storm? Which is a great one. Any other noticings and wonderings? Yes?
The skin of the trees is peeling off. They're
Oh.
rotting.
Okay, and where are you noticing that in particular?
On
Am
the
I-
yellow one,
Here?
yes.
Right, so the
The
bark
yellow-
seems to
on
have
the right.
exfoliated. Okay, yeah, very good. All right, and what does that make you wonder?
Where's the caretaker?
Fair. Who? Yeah. Let me actually. I know you're slightly jesting, but let me just point something out as well. What do we observe about this fallen tree in particular in terms of stewardship? Straight cut, right? That's not a naturally occurring cut. That was somebody with a saw. Yeah, exactly. So what can we wonder about that? What do you think?
People were in a trail and they were making it safer.
Yeah, so you might wonder if this is a human-made trail, right? Which in this area could be a deer path. So I might notice, as you did, that there are straight, true cuts here, which makes me wonder if this is in fact a trail that was made by people rather than by animals, right? It's pretty narrow. It could be either. What else are we noticing and then wondering? Let's get one or two more. And is there anyone in the chat that I'm missing? What time of year was this picture taken? That's a great and very fair wonder. One more?
Well, it's a bunch of pine trees. It's a nest of pine trees. And this big fat one in the front doesn't have any bottom leaves at all. So I don't know whether it's dead or whether the leaves will start up higher.
Oh, okay, interesting. And that particular observation takes us back to a tree we've already learned about today. Pitch pine, which was growing in a pygmy pine barrens landscape, right? So big reveal, these are pitch pines growing at their natural height. Yeah, these are probably, if anything, younger than the ones we saw earlier. And let's see, lichens on the middle right tree was another observation. Yeah, excellent. There are lichens everywhere. What have we learned about lichens? Yeah, good sign of atmospheric health and healthy tree, healthy landscape. Excellent. Let me see if there's anything else we should cover here. Trees,
There's a
trees,
lot
trees.
of sort of brushy undergrowth all around there, which we tend to say, yuck, you're in my way, clear the view. But that's I suspect, an important habitat, a useful part of the whole
ecological experience. Yeah, so you're observing that there is a lot of brushy undergrowth underneath the trees here. And what it might make you wonder is what other animals you could see who's using that space. Yeah, absolutely. I would point out too that there might be an animal that we would wonder if it's missing, deer. Because of course, where there are deer, there's often not undergrowth like this, right? Which
Well, that's the difference between the forests that we see like up here in Bear Mountain, where there's such heavy browsing from the deer, you don't see any understory, any undergrowth, because they've literally wiped out the entire landscape.
Wow.
Because there's too many deer in that particular area. You also don't see that much leaf mite or leaf stuff, mold that has fallen on the ground because of the type of earthworms that are in the area, which are just eating so much of the leaves and taking them away. So that's the other things I noticed there.
yeah,
The
no,
soil is probably not as conducive for earthworm habitats.
yeah, quite possibly. I mean, the other thing that's interesting about this landscape is I didn't see anyone else when I was out there, but I was very curious about the stewardship of it, like who was cutting that log, who was keeping out the deer. I mean, Long Island has about as many deer as New Jersey, so it was kind of astonishing to see this.
I hate those deer. We have 3 or 4 of them that come into the back of my yard, and I really I resent them because they do have ticks, they do spread disease, and they poopy all over the place when we
Yeah.
walk. And then some of them are quite large with big antlers, so they're living well here. Nobody's killing them off and eating them. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
because we have an overgrowth of them on my property.
Yeah, it's what I think one of your original wonders had to do with who might be using this undergrowth. This is also really important bird habitat. So I love seeing scrubby growth. I'll point out a few other things I just have in my notes here that I don't want to miss, and many of you sort of alluded to these. Stands of conifers, these pitch pines growing in a group like this. I'll stop moving. Sorry. The thing it makes me wonder when I see this is how what might be the natural way that these trees spread, right? So you have something like a maple tree where it has a winged samara, its seed can fly. You have something like a pine tree where either the seed is carried by a bird or it just drops to the ground, right? So when I see clumps of trees growing versus when you see a stand of trees and then a large gap and then another stand of trees with different species in between, it makes me think about that, like how does the tree spread? I also notice a few deciduous trees retaining their leaves. The 2 in particular that I'm thinking of, this is a deciduous tree that's retained its leaves, and this is a tree of the same species right next to it. This one doesn't have its leaves on it. And so the question I had, the wonder I had is the tree next to it dead? Because trees that retain their leaves, and you see this here walking around, there are several species in the area, lots of types of oaks, American beech, that keep those dead leaves on all winter. And it's not a sign that they're dead, it's just something they do. Don't ask me if there's an evolutionary advantage. I don't think so. It just happens with some trees and not with others. But the fact that the tree next to it doesn't have its leaves likely means that it retained its leaves through the winter, and then that next spring didn't ever grow back. And then over a certain period of time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, all of those leaves dropped off, and now you have a truly dead tree. So that is my wonder. I'm not sure. I noticed the bark, as you saw, the bark stripped from the fallen log. One of the things I was curious about is that if you look at that log that is stripped of its bark, the bark isn't nearby. There's not like bark on the ground or anything. So I was curious how long the bark had exfoliated, how long it had fallen off. I was curious if it had already decomposed. Bark tissue, spongy tissue, breaks down a lot faster than hardwood, the core of the tree. I was curious if the tree had fallen because there was a storm, as someone commented in the Google form, or if it had a disease. And then another thing, I didn't actually originally notice this, one of my students did, but in this pitch pine there are some holes, which made me curious what type of animal had made those. If you're really good at woodpecker ID, you can actually use like the placement on the height of the bark, on the height of the trunk and how close they are to start to piece together what kind of woodpecker it was. One thing I like about identifying a woodpecker is that certain woodpeckers, like the a hairy woodpecker, yellow-bellied sapsucker, you'll see them in, like, we saw some actually today, or I saw some earlier. But something like a red-headed woodpecker or a pileated woodpecker actually needs a larger acreage of forest. So if you're walking around this neighborhood and you see a pileated woodpecker, I guarantee you've got a forest preserve somewhere, because that's not just hanging around in suburbia. So identifying a woodpecker can often tell you a lot about the health and the size of the landscape. Oh, here, I circled all the things I was talking about. There we go. Great. And then a few other things about this landscape worth pointing out that you can take forward into other observations of landscapes. One is that when you do see a fallen log, that's a great opportunity to quickly count rings. You don't have to count each individual one. You could do a count that matched the size of your thumb and then just count how many thumbs you have up the circumference. I like to do this because when I'm looking at a population of pitch pine, for example, here's maybe a dozen to 25 pitch pines growing in one place. If I know from the fallen log, that is a pitch pine, how old that tree was, I can then extrapolate from a hug how old the other trees might be. And that tells me a lot about how long that landscape has been there for. Another thing you could notice, lichen we've talked about, is air quality. I was also very curious about how the size of this tree differed from the landscape we were just in, the pygmy pines, because this is also sandy soil. So what is different about this sandy soil than the sandy soil, I think it's about 20 miles away, where we have the same population of trees just growing a much more dwarfed state? That's a wonder. I'm still figuring it out. And then the last thing here, this is a little bit of phenology, but noticing where trees are at in their cycle, or plants or birds, can tell you a lot about the landscape generally. Someone earlier on the walk, I forget who it was, mentioned that there was a study done on starlings. Who was talking about that? It was Dan, thank you. Yeah, University of Madison was doing a study on starlings and how their behavior in the spring seemed much more aligned and purposeful, and then the rest of the year it was a little just like looser. Similarly, there are phenological cycles you can observe with trees. This is a red maple that is flowering. Red maples, there's always one red thing about them. So they have red leaves in the fall, they have red fruits developing in the summer, they have red leaves in the early spring, or red buds all winter long. So this flowering was interesting to me because, one, tells me a little bit about the microclimate. Is it flowering early because this particular pond gets good sunlight exposure and has good warmth? It also tells me about the larger microclimate. Is it flowering earlier than trees I might see up in Monroe County? We were talking about that earlier, the difference between here and Monroe County. Or is it telling me over time, wow, these are flowering a lot earlier than they did 10 years ago? And then the last thing, can't leave this space without talking about soil. So we looked at the pygmy pine plains and saw that it was very, very sandy with a thin layer of organic matter content. Here, walking on this path, I noticed sand. I noticed a good deal of organic matter content, and I was happy to see what I thought was like a decent layer of soil, like actual, dirt on the ground. I thought, okay, well, maybe it's not sand all the way down. Maybe that's why these pitch pines are growing so tall. But I took a closer look here. Does anybody know what these are? Maybe it's a little hard to see because the lights are on. But these are, that's an ant mound, and that's a worm mound. That's excavated soil. So one pro tip is if you are not carrying a trowel in your backpack and you want to know what the soil composition is like, you can look for evidence of excavation done by worms and ants, and then that will tell you what soil is underground, right? Because they're carrying it right back up. So indeed, very sandy soil. It just happens to be covered with a layer of organic matter content. All right, I'm going to skip this one, my friends. And now we're going to do an exercise. If your name begins with A through G, I'm going to ask you, just to yourself, to identify the trees in the next video. If your name starts with H through S, just think, I notice landscapes. Just make observations. And if your name begins with T through Z, just check in with yourself about how you're feeling physically and emotionally as you watch this next video. I'm going to play 3 videos. We're all going to get a chance to do these. But we'll start off here at the New York Botanical Garden. Don't be jealous. This is my office. I'll play that one more time. They're pretty short clips. All right, and now we're gonna rotate. So H through S's in this next video, different location within the botanical garden. You're gonna identify the trees. T through Z, try and think of I notice statements about the landscape. And A through G, you're just checking in with how you're feeling physically and emotionally. This is my walk to work. Don't be jealous. Okay. And that one was stationary, so I'm just going to play that one once. And now finally, if you're T through Z, this is your turn to identify the trees. A through G is doing your I notice statements, and H through S, check in with yourself. This is Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, which is up in Terrytown. I really want you to be able to hear this one. Okay. Out of curiosity, 'cause that is the main point of the exercise, which of these felt the best to people? Which practice did you enjoy? Yes?
Number one,
Number one.
yes.
IDing the trees?
No, the extreme.
Oh, no, sorry, not which landscape you liked. Which method of, which practice did you like? Identifying the trees was your first option. Making I notice statements was the second option, and how you're feeling physically and emotionally. Which experience of the landscape felt good to people?
Feeling how I felt.
Okay, why is that for you?
I don't know, just because every time I go out in nature, it feels like it rejuvenates me, it revitalizes me.
Aha, so just to repeat that back, you enjoyed checking in with yourself physically and emotionally because being out in nature feels wonderful.
Yeah.
I would agree. What do you think, Dan?
I heard insects in the final sequence, the dusk and all the trees in the meadow and stuff, which I felt like I was sharing it with other creatures. And I agree with Sylvia's, take on the rest of it.
So let me just double check something. Diane, you were charged with saying I noticed statements and what you noticed was insects. Good. Did you find that the I notice practice was your favorite way of being in the landscape?
I was doing that work, but I like just, wallowing in it.
Yeah.
No strictures or need to know other than what I'm already coming to it with.
Sure. So Dan is saying that, I'm just repeating this back as I was asked you, sorry. Let me know if I'm saying this correctly, that that you did the I notice practicum, but what actually felt really good was wallowing in that space, was being present.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Part of why I asked this is I think, as I have mentioned a couple times now, I participate in the bird watching community. And one thing I noticed right away about the bird watching community is it's very list oriented. People go birding to list those birds. That is not my practice. I'm very much in spaces in a way that sort of gathers all of these different things. I like to know how I'm feeling when I walk into a space. I like to notice how I feel when I leave it. I like to list the birds, but I do that not so much as a way to name them, but as a way of figuring out, okay, what's my prior knowledge about that bird species and what can I extrapolate from that, right? So I find when I do this practice with students, many of them really love the check-in with yourself physically and emotionally, and also will admit, as you just did, Dan, in a reverse way, that while they were doing that, you also were observing better and more, right? Because in checking in and sort of calming yourself down, you're also able to open up a little bit and think like, oh, I wonder why that particular tree's branches are drooping that way, et cetera. Whereas often if you go into a space specifically to say, I found a red maple, I found a tulip tree, I saw a red-bellied sapsucker, there are pieces that are lost, right? So it's not to say that you need to do one versus the other, but to incorporate all of those together into the way you walk through a space can be very useful. So I will, yes? I knew it, okay, thank you. This is the last piece. We did skip one landscape, but it was an abandoned lot in New York, so you didn't miss much. I flipped right through it. It's a cool space. It's invasive species oriented, but that's fine. So let's see. That is down here. I'll just quickly share with you some observations I made about these landscapes, and then we can wrap up. This is the river. This is the first landscape we visited. One of the things I noticed here is that if I'm combining identification with what I observe, this is an American sycamore. One thing that's really unique about the way the American sycamore grows in this landscape is that it's very long and lean. That is, of course, because it is growing next to a very narrow, or inside of a very narrow cliff system. This is very unique in New York. This is a particular type of glacial movement that crafted these high-walled cliffs. And so one thing I was very curious about is that in this particular spot here, this is very evidently a very rocky outcropping. The organic matter content, I presume, is very low on this cliff, which makes me wonder how long these trees will be able to hang on. So it seemed, I made a note to myself, this is a landscape to keep an eye on over the next 20, 30 years, particularly through big storms. Yes?
See, I have sycamore trees
Mhm.
on my back here.
Oh, lovely.
They lose a lot of leaves,
Mhm.
and my neighbors get mad at me.
Uh-huh.
And they're a long-living tree, right? They're
Yes.
really tall.
Yes, yeah.
I get them cut the branches
Mhm.
every 2-3 years,
Mhm.
but they have a lot of leaves and they just.
Yes.
Is that right?
They are, but that's true for all deciduous trees. I mean, it's not unique to sycamores. Yeah, I mean, even if you had planted maple trees, they do the same. Beech trees.
So any like a strong storm comes over, they might withstand that.
Yeah, I mean, American sycamores are generally a pretty healthy tree. They're not susceptible to a lot of diseases. I think they have a beautiful growth habit.
My back here neighbor, they're encouraging me to cut it. No, I didn't. I got somebody, landscaper who knows about it. He said, just cut the branches. Do not.
Yeah.
And my son, Ma, don't cut it.
Yeah, just pruning it should be fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Couple other things to notice here. This is now in our middle landscape. This is the walk across the forest. This is a tulip tree, one of my favorite trees. I was saying earlier that trees change their characteristics as they grow. These vertical stripes are very characteristic of a young tulip tree. And you can see where I'm circling my mouse, the larger leaf. Those leaves will eventually become smaller as it grows. There's another interesting line thing happening here. This is the rock that I was standing on when I took the picture, and those are glacial striations. So that's evidence of glacial till, or like pebbles and bits that were locked in a glacier. As the glacier melted and receded towards the north, it dragged those rocks across this larger boulder and created those striations. One really cool thing about striations, which you all can see in New Jersey in lots of different places, is that they always point north-south. So it's a compass right on the ground for you.
Yeah, but let's say the rock wouldn't be, the rocks wouldn't.
Touché, sir. If the rock hasn't moved in the last 10,000 years or so, then it is a true compass.
And if you go to Central Park, you can see the striations right to the center of Central Park. All the rocks have the grooves in the same direction, north-south, for the glacier.
Three other things to quickly point out about this landscape, and then we'll move to our last, and then I promise we're done. here we have a few interesting things that you all can observe in landscapes near you. One is here, there's this sort of open sunny area with a lot of new growth. These are not trees, these are understory plants, right? This is typically a good sign that there was a recently disturbed area. If you see saplings growing, that area has been open for 7, 8, 9 years. If you're not seeing any saplings growing, you're just seeing new little vegetative growth, that area probably only recently was cleared, right? Because it's only these young and tenacious plants have made their way in. Leaf litter. This is a fantastic way to do tree identification. If the canopy is too high, look down. We did this on our walk earlier. We found examples of what was the fruit we found on the ground. It was an oak acorn, right? So immediately on seeing acorns, boom, it's an oak tree, right? So similarly, these are sweet gum seed pods. You don't even need to look up to know there's a sweet gum nearby. And then finally, this open canopy I thought was such a cool example of time in a landscape. You can see the tree here is bending away from this open space, which tells me that at one point there was a very large tree here blocking that tree's view of sunlight or access to sunlight. So that open canopy must also be at least, I don't know how old this tree is, but if I had to guess, probably 60 or 70 years old. So there was a tree there for at least that period of time. And then lastly, this is the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. This is the one with all the insects. Was this a favorite landscape of anybody else? It's lovely, right? Yeah, the noises are so nice. One thing I find fascinating, this goes back to my original comment about agriculture and my conflicted feelings about it. We have here, silhouetted, an absolutely stunning example of an oak. It's in the white oak family, and I don't remember which one it is. The cauliflower shape of this oak tree tells me that it's never grown in competition with other trees. It was born, raised, and grew in an open field, which tells you a lot about how long ago this land was settled agriculturally. So I, as a person who fell in love with the Northeast as a Midwestern transplant, know that our landscape used to be heavily forested, used to have a lot of American chestnuts. This clearance of land, first through lumber extraction and then now through agriculture, is very new to the Northeast in our relative history. So as much as this is a beautiful landscape, it also makes me a little sad because it is very anthropocentric. It's a human landscape more than anything else. So this is my closing note. I have to say one thing about birds. It's like my duty as a board member of the American Bird Conservancy to end a talk on birds. I wanted today to give you tools to explore a landscape in a new and curious way. I hope we did that. But one thing I'd point out is that all the things we've done so far today were centered around our sensory experience. When we went for a walk earlier, I asked about what do you see, what do you smell, what do you feel, what do you hear? We are extremely unique in our worldview as a species. We are diurnal, we are bipedal, we are upright, and we have forward-facing eyes. And a lot of living life on Earth has none of those things or only one of those things. Birds is a great example because this is an illustration here of forward-facing eyes. That's our nose. We are dominated, our sight is dominated by our forward-facing view, and then peripheral vision is sort of secondary, although very useful to survive. Birds, their peripheral vision is the absolute majority of how they see the world. So as we see the world as something we are moving through, they see the world as something they are immersed in. Really sit with that if you have time, or read this book. But the reason I find that so fascinating is that one of the chief issues I work on with the American Bird Conservancy is creating bird-safe buildings and bird-safe glass. And window strikes, when birds hit your window, is a real problem. And I think people have this concept, potentially, that it's because birds are stupid. It's not. It's because they experience the world totally differently than we do from a visual perspective. And so this is sort of the basis of what could be a 2-hour talk about that issue. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I think it's so important to think about not just how you are experiencing the world and listing all the trees you see, but also what is the experience of all the other living creatures that you're seeing on that walk. So I'm about to teach a class on tree communication, and it's really focused on being trees. So that's going to be a real trip. But starting with birds is a fun one because, gosh, what a lively and wonderful group of social animals to think about. So I'll leave you with that. I think that is the last thing I wanted to say. But yeah, if you wanted to keep up with what I'm up to, you can scan that QR code. And otherwise, I just want to thank you all for your time and even the little bit of extra time you gave me.
Okay.
That was very kind. It's so nice to meet you all.